今日好開心，我哋請到我哋嘅講員 Mark Anderson 嘅太太 Rosna， 佢有為我哋去獻詩，我哋將我哋嘅時間交俾 Rosna。Thank you。
多謝我要跟你們唱一首歌。如果你會唱這首歌，跟我一起唱好不好？
多謝晒 Rosna， 好美妙嘅歌聲，多謝你。跟住落嚟又去到我哋兒童主日學嘅時間啦，我哋而家小朋友可以離開去參加主日學。今日嘅講道主題係以斯帖記，經文係出自以斯帖記2章19到3章15節。請聽以下今日嘅經文：以斯帖記2章19節，第二次召集處女的時候，末底改坐在朝門那裏。以斯帖照着末底改吩咐他的，沒有把自己的身世和種族告訴人。末底改所說的話，以斯帖都遵行，就像昔日養育他的時候一樣。那時，末底改坐在朝門那裏，王有2個守門的太監，辟探和提列，一時因為惱怒，正想下手害亞哈隨魯王。這陰謀給末底改知道了， 他就告訴皇后以斯帖，以斯帖就以末底改的名義對王說起這事。那陰謀查究起來，就發現真相，於是把二人懸掛在木架上。這事在王面前曾寫於史記。這事以後，亞哈隨魯王使亞甲族哈米大他的兒子哈曼晉升，王提拔他，使他的地位高過所有與他在一起的大臣。在朝門那裏，王的所有臣僕都向哈曼屈膝下拜，因為王曾經這樣吩咐，只有末底改不跪也不拜。於是，在朝門的臣僕問末底改：你為什麼違背王的命令呢？他們天天勸他，他還是不聽。他們就告訴哈曼，要看看末底改的話是不是堅持到底，因為他已經告訴他們，他自己是猶大人。哈曼見末底改不向他屈膝下拜，就非常憤怒。他以為只有下手對付末底改一人還是小事，因為有人把末底改的本族告訴了哈曼，所以哈曼設法要把亞哈隨魯王全國所有的猶大人與末底改一起消滅。亞哈隨魯王12年正月，就是尼散月，有人在哈曼面前弄卜普爾，就是抽籤，逐日逐月地抽，結果抽出了12月，就是亞達月。哈曼對亞哈隨魯王說：有一個種族散居在王國各省各民族之中，他們的法例與各族的法例不同，他們也不遵守王的法規，所以留下他們，對王實在無益。王若是贊成，請王降旨消滅他們，我願捐出34萬公斤銀子，交在管理國務的人手中，納入王庫。於是王從自己的手中取下戒指，交給猶大人的敵人亞甲族哈米大他的兒子哈曼。王對哈曼說：這銀子仍賜給你，這民也交給你，你看怎樣好，就怎樣待他們吧。正月13日，王的書記都召了來，照着哈曼的一切吩咐，用各省的文字、各族的方言，奉亞哈隨魯王的名下旨，又用王的戒指蓋上印，頒給總督各省的省長和各族的領袖。王旨交在眾驛使，傳到王的各省，吩咐要在1日之內，在12月，就是亞達月13日，把所有的猶大人，無論老少婦孺，都全部毀滅、殺盡、滅絕，並且搶奪他們的財產，諭文抄本，頒行各省，通告各族，使他們準備好這一天。驛使奉王命，急忙出發，諭旨從書珊城頒布出去。那時王與哈曼有同坐共飲，書珊城的居民卻非常慌亂。這是上主的話。以下落嚟係正道嘅時間，今日為我哋正道嘅係 Mark Adamson， 我將時間交俾 Mr. Mark Adamson。
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a joy to be back here with you again.
各位午安，好開心今日又返到嚟同大家一齊。
And it's lovely to be in a lovely new building.
好開心喺呢一個新嘅教會裏面。
And we're going to continue looking at the book of Esther.
我哋繼續睇以斯帖記。
And one of the unique features about this book is that God's name is not even mentioned in it.
呢本書係好特別㗎，好獨有㗎。點解呢？因為神個名係冇提及過㗎。
When you read through this book, you will not find God's name in it.
當你讀晒成卷嘅以斯帖記，你都揾唔到有神嘅名喺其中。
And yet when you read this beautiful story, you see God clearly and powerfully at work.
但係當你讀到以斯帖呢個故事嘅時候，你好清楚睇到神係好有能力嘅喺度作佢嘅工。
You see him granting favor.
你見到佢真係做佢喜悅嘅事。
You see him bestowing honor.
亦都係值得尊崇。
You see him protecting his people.
你見到神係喺度保護緊佢嘅子民。
And you see him coordinating and orchestrating events and bringing them together that his name might be glorified.
你睇到神係每一件事都係因着佢自己嘅名得到榮耀，而將佢哋係一齊嘅發生，掌管佢哋一齊發生。
And so when you read this book, in a sense, God is hidden, but yet he is very clearly at work.
所以當你睇呢本書嘅時候，好似係神嘅名冇提到，好似神已經隱藏咗，但係你又睇到佢好清楚嘅作為。
And sometimes in our walk with God, it seems that way also.
我哋睇到當我哋係與主同行嘅時候，跟隨主嘅時候，都係咁嘅。
Often we find ourselves in circumstances and we think God is hidden from us.
我哋都睇到，當我哋喺某種環境當中嘅時候，神好似隱藏咗佢自己，我哋睇唔到神。
And yet we know he will never leave us nor forsake us.
但我哋知道神係唔會離開我哋，佢係唔會撇棄我哋嘅。
But there are times in our circumstances we don't see any evidence of God working.
但喺我哋嘅環境當中，我哋又睇唔到咩證據神喺度作工喎。
But I want to encourage you today and tell you that God most definitely is at work.
但係今日我想話俾你聽，我可以保證，其實神係喺度作工㗎。
Even when you don't see him, he's working.
就算你睇唔到佢，其實神都喺度作緊工。
Jesus said, "My Father works and I work."
主耶穌話：我嘅父作工到如到此，我都作工。
The Apostle Paul tells us that God works out all things in accordance with the counsel of his own will.
保羅都話神係照住自己嘅旨意嚟到成全。
And he works all things together for good.
神都係叫萬事都互相效力。
And so I want to encourage us that God is at work in our lives, even at times when we don't see evidence.
所以我好鼓勵大家，就算喺你人生當中你揾唔到證據神喺度作工，但係其實神係喺你人生裏面去帶領緊，佢係作緊工嘅。
Now, when you began these studies in the book of Esther, you'll know that Esther was a young woman living in the vast Persian Empire.
當你開始睇以斯帖記嘅時候，你就睇到以斯帖咧係一個年輕嘅女子，而佢就住喺呢一個波斯大帝國當中。
And the ruler of the empire at that time was a king called Ahasuerus.
咁當時波斯國嘅國王就係亞哈隨魯王。
Now, Ahasuerus was the son of Darius.
亞哈隨魯王其實佢係大利烏王嘅仔。
And Darius was the king in the story of Daniel and the lion's den.
咁如果你睇到咧，其實大利烏王就係當呢個但以理被掟入獅子坑嘅時候，就係大利烏王作王啦。
In addition to being the son of Darius, Ahasuerus was also the grandson of Cyrus.
咁除咗係呢個亞哈隨魯王，除咗係呢個大利烏王嘅兒子咧，佢亦都係呢一個古列王嘅孫。
Cyrus was that individual who issued a decree that the Jewish people could come back to their homeland after being in captivity for 70 years.
咁古列王係邊個呢？就係佢下旨容許以色列人當時係被呢個尼布甲尼撒王所俘虜咗70年之後呢，呢一個古列王就容許以色列民翻自己嘅國土。
And many of them came back, but many also stayed behind to start a life in Persia.
當時好多以色列民翻去以色列嘅國家，但係都有好多以色列民留翻喺波斯大帝國嗰度居住。
And two such individuals who did that we read about in the story of Esther.
喺以斯帖記我哋睇到有兩個人就留低咗啦。
And that's Esther herself and her cousin Mordecai.
就係以斯帖自己同埋佢嘅堂兄末底改。
Now, at the beginning of the story of Esther, the king threw a banquet that lasted 1 week.
咁我知道咧，以斯帖嘅一開始第一章嘅時候咧，就當時呢一個波斯王咧，佢就係有擺筵席，係擺咗1個星期噶。
And towards the end of that week, he summoned his queen Vashti to come to the banquet.
咁當筵席就嚟結束嘅時候咧，呢個王突然之間就宣召皇后要嚟到呢個筵席當中。
But she refused to come, and the king lost face. He was embarrassed in front of his guests.
但係呢個皇后竟然拒絕嚟到，所以咧呢個亞哈隨魯王佢就覺得非常尷尬同埋冇面啦。
And because of that, he removed Vashti from the position as queen.
因着咁呢，佢就廢去呢一個皇后雅實提呢個皇后嘅位。
And so the king then began a quest to choose a new queen.
所以咧，當時咧，佢哋就需要去選一個新嘅王。
Now, the Jewish historian Josephus tells us that there were 400 young women who were seeking that position as queen.
咁呢個歷史學家做司法，佢話俾我哋聽咧，當時係有400個嘅少女去選皇后㗎。
And for a whole year, they went through various treatments and to prepare themselves to be chosen, hopefully, by the king.
咁呢400個少女用咗1年嘅時間去受訓練啦，同埋接受呢個美容啦、護膚啦，咁希望咧係能夠被選為皇后㗎。
And out of those 400 young women, the king chose a young woman called Esther.
喺400個少女當中，呢個王哈隨魯王就揀選咗以斯帖做皇后啦。
Now, that's the background, and that brings us to our text today.
呢個就係以斯帖記嘅背景，係我哋今日經文嘅背景。
Verses 19 to 23 at the end of chapter 2 show us Mordecai overhearing and exposing a conspiracy.
咁喺19至到23節嗰度講到咧，阿末底改咧，佢係偷聽到有人係合謀想謀害皇帝嘅。
He learns of a plot to kill the king.
佢聽到話係嗰啲人呢係想謀害，有一個陰謀啊，就想殺害呢一個皇帝㗎。
Now we are told that Mordecai was at the king's gate.
我哋睇到咧呢一個故事話俾我哋聽，末底改佢當時係坐喺朝門。
Now, this is significant because a number of times in the book of Esther, Mordecai is specifically said at being at the king's gate.
呢個係好重要㗎，因為以斯帖記裏邊曾經多次提到末底改坐喺朝門嗰度。
Now, the king's gate was a place of authority where justice was meted out.
其實當時嘅文化裏面呢，呢個朝門呢就係施行司法裁決嘅地方。
We see a reference to this in the book of Proverbs.
我哋喺箴言都有睇到有咁講㗎。
In Proverbs chapter 31 verse 23, speaking of a godly woman, it says her husband is known in the gates where he sits among the elders of the land.
咁呢喺箴言31章23節就講到一個好聖潔嘅婦女，佢嘅丈夫呢就係同本地嘅長老喺城門口坐住啦。
Now Mordecai, Esther's cousin, is at the king's gate.
咁我哋睇到末底改呢，就係以斯帖嘅堂兄呢，佢就坐喺朝門嗰度。
And so we ask ourselves the question, how did he get to that place of authority?
咁我哋就會問啦，點解呢個末底改有權並可以坐喺朝門嗰度呢？
In verse 11, we read that Mordecai was walking in front of the courts.
咁呢喺第11節呢，我哋都睇到呢，末底改係喺內院嗰度行㗎。
And at that stage, Esther was not queen.
喺嗰個時候呢，以斯帖仲未係王。
She was one among 400 preparing, hoping the king would choose her.
嗰陣時呢，以斯帖仲係400個少女當中嘅一個，佢仲係期望住呢個王會揀選佢。
And Mordecai was there just to learn how she was progressing.
咁末底改喺嗰度呢，就係想知道究竟而家嘅進展係點樣。
But in verse 17, Esther is crowned queen.
但喺17節就話俾我哋聽呢，以斯帖係成為咗皇后啦。
And from that moment onwards, Mordecai is now at the king's gate.
咁喺嗰陣時候，一直睇落去呢，末底改就已經係坐喺朝門嗰度啦。
And so it would seem that Esther as queen used her influence to promote her cousin.
咁好有理由我哋相信呢，就係因為以斯帖已經做咗皇后啦，所以呢，佢就能夠影響到皇上嘅決定，以至到呢末底改而家係有咁嘅身份。
To put him in a place of authority.
王就將佢擺喺一個係有權柄嘅地方。
She may have done that to show appreciation to Mordecai raising her as her own daughter.
或者呢，以斯帖佢想咁樣做嘅時候呢，係因為佢想感謝末底改呢，係將佢養大，當係自己嘅女兒一般養大。
But this is an example of God working behind the scenes.
呢個就係一個好好嘅例子，其實神係喺背後嗰度作工㗎。
Because the fact that Mordecai was at the king's gate,
因為你睇到事實上末底改喺呢個朝門嘅時候。
it enabled him to overhear and expose a plot to kill the king.
就係因為佢坐喺朝門，佢先聽到咧有人想密謀想殺害皇帝。
He reported that to Esther,
於是佢就即刻話俾皇后以斯帖聽，
and the two culprits were hanged.
然後佢兩個咧係被呢個吊死嘅。
The king's life was spared, and the whole incident was recorded in the book of the Chronicles of the King.
於是咧亞哈隨魯王咧就得到拯救啦，而呢件事咧就寫咗喺呢一個史書上面嘅。
Now that's important because it will come to the surface in later chapters.
呢個好重要啊，因為咧喺以後嘅章節咧，我哋會睇翻呢件事嘅。
Now in chapter 3 we meet another character in the story of Esther.
咁第三章咧，我哋以斯帖記第三章，我哋又睇到另外一個人物喎。
A man called Haman.
呢個人叫做哈曼。
And the king promotes Haman to a position of status.
咁咧，王咧就令到哈曼能夠晉升到高官職位。
Now Haman on a number of occasions is referred to as Haman the Agagite.
咁哈曼咧喺好多時嘅經文裏面話俾我聽咧，佢係亞甲族人㗎。
Now that's significant, just as it was significant that Mordecai was at the king's gate.
呢個係好重要，同樣好似末底改常常都話佢坐喺朝門咁重要。
The fact that Haman is referred to as the Agagite gives us insight as to the origin of his hatred towards the Jewish people.
因為咧呢個哈曼咧佢係亞甲族㗎，咁我哋就可以睇到咧，其實亞甲族民咧一早已經好憎以色列民㗎。
Whenever Israel came out of Egypt,
當以色列民離開埃及，
they fought many battles.
佢哋打咗好多仗。
And one group that they fought was a group called the Amalekites. They were descendants from Esau, Jacob's twin brother.
佢係以掃嘅後裔。
And because the Amalekites attacked Israel,
因為馬拉卡呢個佢去攻打呢個以色列嘅時候，
God pronounced a curse on them, and in Deuteronomy chapter 25, he said they would be extinct.
於是咧神佢就去咒詛佢哋。咁喺呢一個申命記25章就話佢哋應該要被消滅㗎。
Now, whenever Saul was king,
當掃羅係王嘅時候，
he conquered the Amalekites and took their king captive.
咁佢咧就已經打勝呢一個馬拉卡人，咁已經係俘虜咗佢哋。
Their king was a man called Agag.
當時嗰個王咧就叫做亞該。
But Saul did not kill him, he spared him.
但係咧，掃羅王冇殺佢，佢留低佢嘅性命。
And because of that, God was not pleased with Saul, and Saul eventually lost the kingship.
咁最後咧，神就唔滿意呢個掃羅，而掃羅後嚟被廢除㗎。
When Saul spared Agag, Samuel stepped in and he hacked him to pieces.
咁當掃羅王佢冇殺呢個亞甲啊嘛，但係咧撒母耳咧佢就出手啦，佢就將佢殺死。
Now Haman knows his history.
其實哈曼係知道呢個歷史嘅。
Haman is called Haman the Agag because he's a descendant of that king Agag.
點解呢個哈曼叫做亞甲族人？就係因為當時呢一個亞甲王本應被掃羅殺死，而掃羅冇殺死嘅嗰個王嘅後裔。
He knows that a Jewish king called Saul captured his descendant.
哈曼係知道咧，猶太人嘅王咧就叫做掃羅，佢係捉咗佢嘅祖先㗎。
And he knows a Jewish prophet called Samuel killed him.
佢亦知道撒母耳咧係一個以色列嘅先知，係殺死咗佢。
In addition to that, Mordecai is a descendant of Kish.
咁你知道末底改咧，佢就係猶太人嘅後裔，
And Kish was the father of Saul.
係掃羅嘅爸爸。
And so Haman knows his history of the descendants of Saul fighting with the descendants of Agag.
所以哈曼係知道咧呢一個歷史，就係掃羅嘅後裔係同亞甲嘅後裔係戰爭嘅。
And that fuels his hatred towards the Jewish people.
所以呢個哈曼咁憎猶太人。
Now Haman, as I said, is promoted to a position of status by the king.
咁哈曼喺呢個時候咧，又被王去晉升喎。
And in verse 4, we read that the king's servants would bow down to Haman.
第4節我哋睇到咧，當時咧個王嗰啲所有嘅臣僕咧，一見到呢個哈曼都要跪拜㗎。
All of them bowed down except Mordecai, Esther's cousin.
全部人都跪拜，只有以斯帖嘅堂兄末底改佢冇跪拜。
Now, Haman initially did not set out to kill Mordecai.
佢哋之前呢都冇諗住哈曼咧開頭都冇諗住要殺呢個末底改㗎。
He only began to do that when he learned who Mordecai's people were.
就係因為咧呢個哈曼知道原來末底改係猶太人，先至想殺佢。
He learned that they were Jewish.
佢知道佢哋猶太人。
And so what Haman does is he casts lots.
咁然後咧就抽籤。
This was a practice that was given, that was done in that time.
喺當時咧好興抽籤嘅。
In fact, the Jewish people also did it to seek guidance from God.
其實猶太人亦都係求籤咧嚟到去得到神嘅指引。
In fact, whenever Jesus ascended, the disciples cast lots to choose a replacement for Judas.
咁我哋知道咧，《使徒行傳》都講咗啦，當猶大吊頸死之後咧，佢哋咧啲門徒，主嘅門徒都係抽籤，係揾人去替代猶大噶。
And so Haman consults astrologers and magicians to find out the right day to kill the Jewish people.
所以當時哈曼咧就求嗰啲術士咧去抽籤去揾一日嚟到殺死全部嗰啲以色列民。
Now in verses 8 and 9 we see how manipulative and controlling Haman is.
咁我哋睇第8同埋第9節 ，sorry 我啲先。
Verses 8 and 9.
我哋睇到第8同埋第9節。
In verses 8 and 9, we see that Haman is very manipulative and controlling.
咁我哋睇到咧，其實哈曼咧佢係好有種控制同埋操縱權嘅。
He first of all tells the king that there is a certain people, a certain group of people.
佢開頭同王講咧就話有一堆嘅民族。
You see, the Jewish people have retained their identity.
因為當時咧猶太人咧佢就冇話俾人哋聽，佢都係保持佢自己嘅身份。
But Haman at this point does not divulge their identity to the king.
但係哈曼呢個時候就冇話俾王聽係猶太人。
He just says there's a certain people.
佢淨係話有一種嘅民族。
Now what he does next is he tells a half-truth to the king.
然後佢淨係講一半嘅真話同王。
He says this certain people have their own laws.
佢話呢一班人啊，佢有佢自己嘅律法㗎。
And that is true.
其實係真嘅。
But then he says they do not keep the king's laws.
然後咧但係咧佢又加咗一句，佢哋唔會聽王你嘅命令㗎。
And that's false.
呢個係假嘅。
So he deliberately does that to manipulate the king.
所以咧佢特登咁樣講去操縱王。
Hoping that the king will be angry that these people do not keep his laws.
佢希望個王就會好嬲，因為佢一聽到原來呢一班民族咧係唔聽我嘅律法嘅，我嘅法律嘅。
And before the king can respond, Haman now offers the king money.
咁喺一個王有反應之前咧，呢一個哈曼咧就話佢會俾錢王喎。
He's seizing the opportunity. He's trying to manipulate and control the king.
因為咧佢睇到有一個機會，佢可以操縱到同埋控制到王。
That the king will sign a decree that will give Haman the permission to kill the Jewish people.
咁王就會簽一個嘅勒令，下令咧就會容讓呢個哈曼殺晒以色列民。
Now, verse 12 tells us the very date that this decree was issued.
12節嗰個話俾我哋聽係幾時呢個命令去頒發㗎？
And it was done on the 13th day of the first month.
係正月嘅13日。
Now that is significant.
呢個好重要。
Because Exodus chapter 12 tells us that the feast of Passover is on the 14th day of the first month.
因為咧喺出埃及嘅話俾我哋聽咧，呢一個逾越節咧就係正月嘅第14日。
That's the day the Passover lamb was slaughtered.
係正月14日逾越節嘅羔羊被殺。
And here this decree is sealed on the day before Passover.
咁 咁而呢一個嘅命令呢，係喺逾越節之前嚟到頒發嘅。
But I'm sure the Jewish people, when they learned of that decree and the timing of it,
我相信當時嘅猶太人呢，當佢聽到呢一個命令頒發嘅日期，同埋諗到逾越節嘅時候，
despite their fear, maybe they encouraged one another,
雖然佢哋好驚，但係佢哋會互相鼓勵。
reminding themselves that Passover, God delivered his people from Pharaoh and from the bondage and slavery of Egypt.
佢哋會立刻互相鼓勵，大家彼此提醒，因為昔日神係喺呢一個逾越節呢，係將佢哋以色列民從埃及嗰度救出嚟、釋放出嚟。
And so maybe they encouraged themselves by saying, God did it for us in the past, he'll deliver us from the cruelty of Haman.
所以可能當時佢哋都互相鼓勵，既然神喺過去都可以將我哋喺埃及嘅王手中可以救出嚟嘅時候，今日神都可以幫助我哋可以勝過哈曼。
And in verse 13, we are told the content of this decree.
咁喺13節話俾我哋聽，究竟呢一個命令嘅內容係乜嘢？
This decree gives the instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews.
呢個命令嘅內容呢，就係話要將以色列民全部毀滅、殺盡、除盡。
He goes on to say, young and old, women and children,
無論老少婦孺，
no one is to be spared.
冇一個可以放過。
And you know something? Nothing has changed even in our day.
就算今日啊，其實都冇咩改變。
Towards the end of last year, a terrorist group called Hamas has got that same mentality to destroy, kill, and annihilate all Jews.
就係喺舊年嘅年尾，哈馬斯我哋都聽過佢哋呢一個嘅黨嘅人呢，佢哋要將以色列民完全趕盡殺絕。
The word Hamas is a Hebrew word. It's in your Bible translated as violent.
哈馬斯其實希伯來文就係話呢個粗暴、暴力。
Now, this chapter finishes on a kind of a cliffhanger.
其實呢一個嘅呢一章呢，其實就好似喺懸崖，佢嘅佢結尾嘅時候呢，就好似懸掛住喺個懸崖一樣。
The king's decree is being sent by the royal mail to all the provinces in his empire.
因為呢個王亞哈隨魯王佢嗰個命令呢，係即刻呢係傳到各城各省嘅，係佢自己王嘅士兵就去譯傳嘅。
And while that is going on, we read that the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the rest of the city was thrown into confusion.
喺15節嘅時候，我哋睇到咧，當時亞哈隨魯王同埋哈曼就坐喺度一齊飲酒，但係書珊城嘅居民就非常混亂啦。
So you've got quite a contrast. You've the king and Haman drinking, but the rest of the city in confusion.
所以你睇到好強烈嘅對比，因為亞哈隨魯王同埋哈曼就喺度飲酒作樂，但係書珊城所有嘅居民佢哋又非常之驚，非常之慌亂嘅。
And so what we have read today in the end of chapter 2 and the whole of chapter 3,
所以今日我哋所睇到嘅係第2章嘅最後同埋第3章嘅去到15節，
tells us of two plots.
話俾我哋聽有2個嘅陰謀。
In chapter 2, there was a plot against the king,
喺第2章嘅陰謀就係話想殺呢個亞哈隨魯王，
and it failed.
但係失敗咗。
And in chapter 3, there's a plot to destroy the Jewish people.
而第3章呢，就有另一個陰謀，呢、個陰謀呢，就要殺晒全部嘅以色列民。
And I'm not going to tell you how that works.
咁我唔會話俾你聽之後成唔成功，
That's not part of my text today.
因為唔係我今日所要講嘅經文，
So you can read ahead or wait till the next person deals with the outcome.
所以你可以翻去自己睇，亦都可以等到下一個講員嚟講。
But what I am going to tell you is what I said at the very beginning.
但係我想話俾你聽，就好似我頭先一開始所要講咁。
Although God's name is not mentioned in the book of Esther, He is working powerfully behind the scenes.
雖然神嘅名喺以斯帖記冇提過，但係其實咧喺背後咧，神係不斷喺度作工，係非常有能力嘅。
He's granting favor and He's bestowing honor.
佢亦都係佢有佢自己嘅尊榮。
He's protecting his people
佢係保護緊佢嘅子民，
and coordinating events to bring everything together for his glory.
係佢安排一切，然後將一切事之所以發生，都係要嚟榮耀佢自己嘅名。
And he does that in your life and mine as well.
神一樣會喺你同埋我嘅生命當中咁樣做。
Amen.
阿門。
Thank you.
多謝。